Hello, good afternoon. We have to use a mic supposedly for the recording, so welcome to this learning lab on linear growth. My name is Jeff Devois. I'm with the International Food Policy Research Institute.
Ed Frangelo, I'm at the University of South Carolina in the United States.
So we will be doing this in a couple of parts. We will start with some exercise, group work. Are you excited? No? It's okay. I don't like this group work myself, so it's very light. You can manage, okay? Then Ed will present first. His presentation is up already. Then I will present, and then if all goes well, we should have time at the end for questions and answers and discussion. We're happy for you to raise your hand during the presentation if something is not clear. We don't want to start an entire discussion during the presentation, but if you have a clarification question, you should just go ahead, raise your hand. And if we feel that it gets a bit out of hand, we'll say, let's wait till the discussion to continue that conversation, okay? Good. So as promised, we'll start with some group work, okay? So it's very simple. We have some notepads here, and it's very hard to, okay. So I have some notepads here. So if you just can self-organize in groups, you can decide how many you want to be in a group. And you just write down what the most important problems are in terms of undernutrition in children, like globally. You can define what undernutrition is, you can define what important is. I mean, that's up to you. So just write down in your little group what the key global undernutrition problems are in children. Okay? That's what you have to do. You have about 2 minutes or so. So I'll pass these out, grab. Do you need something to write? So it's just like organize yourself in little groups, chat a little bit, you can do it. Take just one and then one notepad. Do you need pencil? Do you have something to write? Oh, okay. Paper, you have pencils. Pay attention. Hello. Yes, okay. Now I'm gonna just quickly go through all the groups and you just kind of read me your list, okay? We want this to be, don't give me a chapter, give me bullet points, okay? All right, first group. Yeah, no, I can do
it. Stunting,
okay.
Wasting, low birth weight, inadequate feeding practices,
okay.
Impaired cognitive practices, development, anemia and micronutrient deficiencies, environmental enteropathy,
okay.
and protein energency deficiency.
Okay, thank you. Are you a group too? Same.
Yeah.
All right. She's efficient. I like that. You have people in this group who will start. It's like, yeah.
We have only two additional. Three. The hidden hunger. The UNICEF framework has not been updated for 20 years. For nutrition. And the last one is how to measure the impact of multi-sector intervention on stunting.
Okay. Good. Same group. You've been covered. All right.
3 points are stunting,
Uh-huh.
anemia, especially iron deficiency
Yeah.
anemia, severe acute malnutrition.
Okay. Very good. I go to you next. Are you the rapporteur?
Almost the same. Stunting, wasting, decreased cognition and development, and micronutrient deficiencies.
Okay. We're reaching saturation here. I'll come to you.
Dietary quality, wash, affordability, and complementary feeding.
Okay, thank you. Now it's your turn.
So Carol just wants me to tell you we struggled to answer your question because we didn't know what you meant by problems. But we said nutrition-related causes of morbidity and mortality and an indicator of overall poor environment that the kids being raised in.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a group here? Yes.
So we weren't sure how far down the framework to go, but we had stunting, wasting, and micronutrient deficiencies. We had overweight, but I don't know if we're only talking about underweight. low birth weight, mother's nutrition, and environmental enteropathy. Is that what we had so far?
Thank you. Last group, I think. No, we have one more.
I can probably add the ones which are not
Yeah.
covered. Maternal height. Diseases.
Yeah.
Diarrhea. Maternal height, diseases, being diarrhea, intrauterine growth, birth weight, child feeding, including complementary feeding and breastfeeding, and micronutrient deficiency, sanitation.
Okay. And you were the last group? Oh, you this has been covered. Okay. Did you have anything to add? No? Good. All right. So all I really wanted, this was a bit of a trick question. I wanted to see if how important stunting would be in this group, and it's important. Most groups had written it down. So now the second assignment, and again, this should only take a couple of minutes. Why is stunting important? Okay, so you said it's an important problem. Now we need to know why it is important. If you didn't write it down, you can take a bit of a break. Okay, it's like this group is looking at me already. It's like, you don't have to do this, right? It's like, no, you don't have to do this, okay? So we don't make a lot of noise during your break so the others can focus. All right, so 2 minutes to tell us why stunting is important. Thank you.
Yeah, but it's also itself, it's an indicator. I think that's she said it's an indicator of yes. And it's the chronic malnourishment. So it's a good indicator.
Yeah, no.
But not for these kids tomorrow. Like, that's not the
Okay, 30 more seconds. Okay, I'm starting in the back of the room here. You're a dog, right?
Okay, so we were still going, but we got things like it's a really useful, easily understood indicator that's then useful for policy narratives because you can tell people about it quite simply. It's a useful proxy for a lot of real things that we can't measure, and it's easily linked to a lot of issues that people are interested in, like food and agriculture and health.
Okay. Yes.
It is a cumulative effect of malnutrition, especially the undernutrition. It carries generation to generation. The effects are irreversible as well as the effects are has a great social and economic deprivation or the poverty linked.
Okay.
It is associated. So for that purpose, once you study the stunting, so it will reflect the entire picture of that, whether it is a social or a behavioral, whatever kind of malnutrition in that particular area of the particular group, it will reflect.
Thank you. All right, you're next.
It's a marker for overall development, and it reflects about the pedigree and further development. It's associated with lower cognitive ability, higher risk of other diseases, affecting due to lower income, and yeah, that's it.
Okay. Ooh, you're next.
Just to add, impacts on poor schooling and performance, productivity and future earnings.
Can you say that again?
poor school performance, productivity, and future earnings.
Okay.
As a result of an efficient environment, increasing the risk of infectious diseases, intergenerational consequences, obstructed labor, marker of poor nutrition, gestational age.
Okay, thank you. Don't repeat things that you've heard already, so we can move a bit faster, okay? If that's
Almost the
possible.
same.
Okay.
Lesser productivity during their adult life and unnecessary expenditure on health, like
Okay.
since and if it is a girl child, it continues through intergenerational cycle.
Okay. Thank you. We don't talk to you. You're all part of the same group, right?
No.
No, you're a separate group.
Yeah, it's almost same.
Okay.
Low cognition, low productivity, low
Okay.
GDP,
Okay.
low development.
Low. Okay. You're next.
It increases the cost of healthcare. Yeah, the rest has been mentioned, I think.
Okay. Yep.
I think a lot of people already said something similar, but that it's an indicator of many things that may be going wrong that manifests in several things you said.
That's been covered already.
Okay. You want to add something?
Stunted growth results in low adult height, which is linked with low muscle mass and increases the risk of non-communicable diseases.
Okay. Okay, very good. So this is very interesting because the first round was kind of the same as last year. Stunting was pretty big, high on the list. The second question about why it's important, we hear very different answers. So we hear a combination of it's a marker of many things going wrong. It's a marker of future problems. We didn't hear a lot of the causal language that stunting causes children not to develop well or causes problems later in life. So that's really what we hope to talk about today in this session, okay, to kind of make it a bit more clear, like where stunting or the focus on linear growth, where it comes from, what it is useful for, and where we probably need to focus on other things. That's what we want to do in a nutshell, okay? If this is not what you thought this would be, then this is your moment to kind of go grab another coffee or something, okay? All right, over to Ed.
So, I'm going to talk about, well, as the title said, linear growth measures to assess two things, impact, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of catch-up growth. And this is work that's been done with Jeff and I in discussion also with Karen Lapping. Okay, so this is the first growth chart came because this guy, Count, well, you can pronounce French better than me, plotted his son's growth, his own son's growth, every 6 months from birth up to 18 years. And plotted that, and then was able to generate this velocity curve here that was published by George Buffin, and then in 1942, Thompson did more analysis with this data set. And what's interesting is that, you know, this is a growth chart now, that a modern growth chart at the bottom here, and it looks very much the same, right? That's the typical pattern we see for boys, with the fastest growth occurring right after birth, and the fastest growth ever velocity is right after birth, and then during puberty we get this jump up. So this was the period here in the mid-1700s that we had this first growth chart. In the UK in the 1800s was the first epidemiologic study showing that linear growth was related to material deprivation. So it goes back that far. And then jumping way ahead, the term stunting was only coined in 1972, so that's a relatively new term. In 1974 is when Habak et al. Published a paper showing that if you look at children from many different places in the world, but who've all been growing in situations that shouldn't constrain growth, that they all grow similar. We're talking about young children. Then the first international growth reference was made from US data in 79 and then revised in 83. The first report by the UN at the time, now it's called Standing Committee on Nutrition, the first report of the world nutrition situation used weight for age, and that was published in 1987. So part of the reason for showing this is it's really not that long ago that we've been doing global monitoring. The WHO review on the uses and interpretations of anthropometry started in 1991 and went for 4 years under an expert committee that was appointed. And in November '95 is when the Green Book that many of you might have seen was published. The infant subcommittee of that, this is the bottom row there, published its own report as part of this called the Evaluation of Infant Growth, which made the case for why we needed new growth standards. In starting the beginning in '96 is when the multi-center growth reference study was designed, which was intended to build new growth standards. Around the same time is when Robert Fogel published some work using recorded heights, arguing that height captured living conditions in historic time and used that to look at the consequences for health and income over a couple of centuries, for which he won the Nobel Prize. So that was an important thing. The third report of the World Nutrition Situation was published at the end of 1997, and that was the first one that used height, length for age and height for age for global monitoring rather than weight for, or in addition to weight for age. So the multi-center growth reference study was in the field during this period. The first growth standards cross-sectional were in '06. Field testing started in countries, and then the velocity references were published in '09. And WHO revised and basically released a revised growth reference, not a standard, for children aged 5 to 19. So the growth standards for the children under 5 were based on longitudinal data for the first 2 years, really 3 years, and then a cross-sectional part afterwards, but was based on the idea that whereas a reference describes the growth of children in a particular population, what growth do they show, that a standard tells us about how children should grow when they've been fed in conditions and cared for in conditions that don't constrain growth. All right, so in that sense, it's prescriptive about how growth should occur. And now about 3/4 of the countries have adopted those standards, and at this point, the global databases have been updated. Now, one of the main motivations for building new growth standards, which was well documented by the infant subcommittee of that WHO review, was that when one was evaluating individual children using the old growth references, the International Growth Reference, that misdiagnoses or misscreening decisions were being made because the pattern of growth of breastfed children is very different than what the reference was showing, and that made a difference in terms of clinical or health worker judgment. So those represent examples of individual uses of screening and diagnosis and monitoring. But there are also many population uses which are listed here, and we're going to mostly focus on the bottom two, monitoring and catch-up growth as an example of monitoring, and then impact evaluation. But I'll start off just talking about estimation or prevalence to just give us some context. So estimating prevalence is about how many are affected, and it's a sort of standard way that epidemiologists think about populations. So what do? We use equipment of various kinds to measure weight and length. This is what we do when we measure anthropometry. When length and height is our particular interest today. And we've come to form z-scores from that, which are basically comparing to the reference or standard. And we started doing that actually because it made it easier to estimate prevalence. Because it allows you to do is to take children of the two different sexes and of varying ages in a reasonably modest window and combine them together so that you can estimate prevalence for that group. All right? That's why it was invented. But the idea of z-scores has now been applied in many other situations. So we'll talk a little bit about those. And we use an indicator often that less than minus 2 standard deviations, which is kind of like almost off the chart to the left, that's a cut point that we use to define stunting or underweight or wasting. Okay. Now, from the beginning, we recognized that although we may classify children in a population as being stunted or not, that actually what happens in a population where growth is constrained is that the entire distribution gets shifted to the left. And this isn't new. This is from the WHO report from Chinese children that were available at the time. And you can see that the average z-score here is -2. So that means automatically about half the children are classified as stunted. But in reality, all of the children have a growth deficit because these children should have been up here, right? So the whole population shifted. Okay, so how do we use this when we're assessing prevalence? This is from the 2013 Lancet series, and I just extracted the Asia here. So we can see in Asia, this is the number, which are these bars, and then the prevalence, which is the blue. And you can see that things improved in Asia pretty dramatically. And over this period of time, the prevalence went from 49% in 1990 to 28% in 2010, which is about 1 percentage point per year. So that's tells us that on a sort of regional basis, that's about as fast as we might expect things to improve. If we convert that to the change in height for age z-score itself, not stunting as an indicator, then that's about a little more than half of a standard deviation, half a z-score, or about 0.03 per year. And I think this illustrates part of the reason why, and somebody in the discussion before mentioned this, part of the reason why we like stunting and talk about it is because it kind of is dramatic, right? It's we're counting children, and you can see over this period, over 20 years, we've had a drop in prevalence of about 21 percentage points. Wow, that sounds like a lot. Whereas if you say, well, it went up by 0.6 standard deviations, that's just not as exciting. All right, so that's part of the reason why we really focus on that. And sort of set aside that we know that when 49% or 28% are stunted, that's really underestimating the number of children who are burdened by the poor environment in which they grow. Okay, so today, we're in this period where the Millennium Development Goals have ended. 4 years ago, the reckoning occurred. Those goals used monitoring of malnutrition and used underweight as a measure of poverty. But by the time 2015 came around, there was already the idea that stunting was a better measure of the healthy development of population, as a number of groups mentioned. In part because the reasons you said, which is it's a cumulative, and it's a sort of thought to be a more stable estimate, and tell us about what's happened in utero as well as and over the generation, as well as just what's happened immediately, which we would potentially have for weight. So for the Sustainable Development Goals, stunting reduction is one of the key targets of Goal 2, and there's even discussion about stunting is really a tracer, a more general indicator of overall progress. It's that important. Okay, so we spent some time trying to think about why is it, and you did it in your discussions as well, why is it that we focus so much on stunting? And there's some very good reasons why it's been powerful and brought a lot of attention to nutrition in particular and the development of children in general. That it reflects accumulation of processes that affect nutrition of the child and in fact the larger development of the child. it can be done well and objectively. It's an objective measure that can be implemented at large scale. That's not easy to find. That it, but also that there's been a confusion, and this is the idea of teaching to the test. So this happens in the educational sector as well. Once we have a measure of something, that's a measure of some construct, that we tend to then end up focusing on the measure. It's just a natural thing that happens. And so we've focused on stunting and linear growth in part because we've decided that's a useful thing to measure, but now it becomes the thing, right? And Jeff will talk more about that in his talk. Linear growth, I think, is also a focus because it appears simple to understand and is familiar. The idea of it can be communicated. And also, though, that it is useful for some purposes. It's certainly brought global attention as we've monitored populations and shown the burden in populations of stunting. So for estimating prevalence, despite its limitations, it's proven useful. But then because measures that tend to be useful for one thing, then automatically are soon to be useful for other things. And that may not be the case. And that's one of the things we're going to discuss. And then lastly, I think it's important to point out that part of the reason for the appeal of linear growth is because we've long thought about children in particular. Children's bodies represent them and what's happened to them. And it's a physical, visual representation when we see children who are malnourished or children who are short, which if one goes out to into many countries in poor areas, that one can see children that are clearly shorter than they would otherwise be if they were in a better environment. But there's some consequences of this focus on linear growth, and one of them is that often we see a lack of demonstrable program effects in reducing stunting. So programs that have targeted stunting as one of the primary outcomes, not always, but fairly often, don't show effects on stunting in the usual program cycle. Secondly, that it puts the emphasis on the biology of growth rather than on and how to improve the environments in which children are living, which is really the issue. That evaluations sometimes are not well prepared to use measures that are responsive to nutrition sensitive and integrated programs, which are going after intermediate outcomes or processes that, for example, agriculture can help with or the educational sector can help with. And stunting may not be good outcomes for those. That it's what we've seen is the emergence of a focus on the window of opportunity that we now call 1,000 days, and that was a good thing for nutrition. In 2007, when the SCN meeting was in Rome, and the vice president of the World Bank came and spoke and really chastised the nutrition community for not having its act together and not having a clear voice about what the priorities are, helped to catalyze that this focus should be on 1,000 days, which has served well and served children well, but nevertheless it's been perhaps at the cost of not enough attention to adolescents and other age groups. And then we've also seen, because of a focus on linear growth, claims for catch-up growth of children using methods, as we'll talk about later, that are completely incapable of actually showing catch-up growth, and we'll talk about why that is. And then finally, insufficient investment to develop other measures. If we acknowledge that other measures, other constructs of children's development are important, we need to be able to measure those. So we'll spend a little time at the end discussing that. So what I want to do first is talk about impact evaluation. I want to show 3 examples. They're all from Bangladesh, because that's the country I know. And this is from the MiniMat study, which was fielded from 2001 to 2003. It was a randomized study, a very complicated study. I'm only showing sort of part of the complication here. But the main idea was to compare early invitation to food supplement in the first trimester of pregnancy with the usual invitation of the government program at the time, which was in the second trimester, the argument being earlier should be better. and then to test out whether adding multiple micronutrients to the usual iron folate formulation would be better. And the real hypothesis was that this group right here, that there would be a synergy, that the moms who got food early but also got multiple micronutrients, they themselves and their offspring would be better off. Right? So that was the main hypothesis of this study. And so these are the key outcomes that were measured. So birth weight, this was part of the low birth weight initiative of UNICEF, so that was an important outcome. There were no differences in birth weight. Height for age of 24 months was another key outcome. You can see all the z-scores are between minus 1.9 and 2, minus 2, so there was no difference there. But neonatal mortality, and then subsequently infant mortality, because most of the mortality is neonatal and it gets carried forward, there was a dramatic reduction in mortality. So this is an example of a study that had clear nutritional inputs of nutrients and food, where there was no effect on stunting or birth size, but yet there was dramatic reduction as hypothesized in mortality. And in this studies, many other outcomes were looked at, and many of which showed important effects besides the linear growth. It's interesting to note that the biggest group differences in birth weight here was 52 grams, but during the study, during the 2 years of recruitment, the babies that were born from the beginning in the end differed by about 80 grams. So there was a clear secular improvement that was going on. So it's not that things can't change, it's just that these differential interventions didn't change differentially. Okay. So the second example is from Alive and Thrive, the first phase of Alive and Thrive, which was done in 3 countries, one of them being Bangladesh. And the idea of Alive and Thrive was to try to show whether a large-scale intensive program could be delivered in a feasible way, and would it have an impact? And so it reached almost 2 million households through multiple platforms, and in a nutshell, the intensive intervention group areas compared with the non-intensive, got the standard program, substantially improved breastfeeding and complementary feeding practices, strong evidence of advancement in language and motor development, and even that was partially explained through the improved complementary feeding, but there was no difference in stunting between the two types of areas. And it was noted at the time that during this period that again there was a rapid secular trend in linear growth in Bangladesh at that time. And then the third one is the BRACS program for the ultra-poor. This was when it was first implemented as a sort of a starting program, if you like, in 3 districts in the northwest part of the country. And the idea was that there would be an 18-month grant phase where that recipients would get training and asset transfer and social supports. This is a livelihood intervention, income generating activities, and then they would graduate to the regular BRAC program, and 49% of them did graduate. And the evaluation, part of the evaluation that Chaudhry Jalal led in 2006 showed really strikingly large improvements, effect sizes of more than 1 standard deviation in subjective well-being, and about half a standard deviation of food security and economic status, strong effects on reducing domestic violence, improvement in weight for height in one of the age groups, but no effect on linear growth. So the blue line is the program group and the red line is the control. The program group's worse off because it's a quasi-experimental design, and they were selected to be the worse off. But you can see the lines are parallel, so there was no differential effect on stunting. But you can also see that the lines are going up. So on average, over those 4 years, it was about a 0.5 z-score improvement, which is kind of like what we were talking about for Asia. Right? Okay, so there's 3 examples. One, as I said, strong nutritional inputs. A second one was a behavioral study. And this third one was a livelihood study. So all of which clearly had important effects on the well-being of recipients, but didn't show up in linear growth. Okay, so let's move to catch-up growth, and then we'll sort of pull things together at the end. So what I'm showing you here is a way of sort of grounding this. Is in 1992, Michelle Lampel published a paper with a couple of colleagues in Science, where she showed she had measured 3 infants daily for several months, another 18 infants semi-weekly, twice a week, and another 10 weekly. This is showing one of the children who was measured daily. This child was measured daily from about 3 months, 90 days, up to 218 days, 7 months. And you can see clearly from the picture that it's a step function. All right? And so it turns out there's 13 saltations here. What saltations are episodes of growth, if you count them up, which is 12% of days. And the mean in the jumps is about 9 millimeters, 0.9 centimeters. So what we learn from this is that children grow on some days, but they don't grow on most of the days. Right? And it's a process of what she called saltations or jumps, and then the stasis periods when there's no growth. And in the stasis periods, there clearly is, it averages to 0. All right? So why am I telling you that? Well, if we're thinking about the idea of children having deficits in growth, that maybe we can make up for that, then how could that occur? Well, it could be that growth deficit occurs because a saltation is delayed. It just comes later than it should have, and so everything is just strung out. It could be that a saltation is canceled and we just lose it. There wasn't the resources to mount that saltation, that growing on a particular day, and so it's gone. I'm sorry, we don't get to see that again. Or it could be that the saltation occurs, but the amplitude, the amount of the jump is less. All right, so depending upon which it is, then we could reschedule a saltation. If there is to be catch-up growth, we'd have to reschedule a saltation or replace one that's been lost or augment the amplitude of one that had a reduced amplitude. Those are the only ways it can happen. What we know, and this is really the only study that gives us this information, is a study that a veterinarian at Cornell, Nellie Farnham, led, a study with rats, the rats were exposed to severe acute malnutrition for about 7 days, and then they were given back their usual diet. And what the study showed was that the recovery of bone elongation rates was really rapid. The velocity jumped up right away. That restoration to the expected length, in other words, back where they should have been, it would take a really long time, longer than she was willing to wait, even though the study went on for quite a long time. And that was true here, even with the insult being a very short duration. And for children, that's not usually what happens. The insult is usually a long duration. So the idea of restorative growth really comes from 2 concepts in the human biology literature. One is called homeoresis, the notion that growing organisms of all kinds tend to return to their paths of growth after deviating from them. So if you get knocked off your growth channel, you tend to sort of try to get back on it. And the concept of catch-up growth was defined this way, and is the standard definition of catch-up growth. It's height velocity above the statistical limits of normality. So it's about velocity, and it's about really fast velocity during a defined period of time, which follows a transient period of growth inhibition. The effect of catch-up growth is to take the child back towards their pre-retardation growth curve. So this definition doesn't require full restoration, but it says that if the inhibition is removed, it could occur, but it's unlikely to occur if there's a really prolonged inhibition. So what we did was translate that definition into 4 criteria, which come directly from the definition. So the first is that in one period, there has to be some condition which inhibits growth. That then results in reduced velocity. And then there has to be a period that follows where the inhibiting condition is taken away, which allows the child to then potentially catch up. And then we actually have to see that in terms of a higher than normal velocity. So all 4 of those are required. And the reason that we laid it out this way is because in the literature are many, many studies, including very recent studies, that talk about catch-up growth that don't come close to addressing these 4 criteria. So then this raises some questions about what's higher than normal velocity, and velocity of what? How do we actually measure velocity? So these are some graphs that Jeff put together. He's obviously more artistically inclined than I am, so thank you for that. So the idea of catch-up growth is that, all right, let's say this is the growth standard, and the growth standard, as we'll talk about in a minute, represents where the child should be, and they're not there. They're lagging behind. Okay, so in this period, something's happened to keep them behind, and the idea of catch-up is that in the second period, that inhibition is removed, and then the child is able to get closer. And even if they can't get all the way there, they're gaining speed fast enough that they catch up. That's the notion. Whereas for impact, which we've already talked about, the requirements aren't nearly as strict, right? All that happens is that, okay, you have this group here, these are representing a group, and you have a comparison group, and maybe this is at baseline, and then at end line, what you hope is that this group has separated itself from the comparison group, but it doesn't say anything about where they have to be, they just have to be better, right? And that's what we look for in an impact evaluation. All right, so velocity of what? So height for each z-score, as we talked about before, is where we compare, in this case, height or length to the median of a growth standard, and we divide by the standard deviation. That's how we construct it. And we've defined some of our earlier work, just the numerator of that, which is height for age difference, which is just how far apart are you in centimeters from where you could have been or should have been according to the standard. All right, so our argument is that height for age z-score cannot be used to assess catch-up growth. Cannot. The reason is because catch-up growth is about velocity, and the velocity of height for age z-score doesn't exist. It doesn't even make sense to talk about that. That what matters for outcomes or changes in absolute height anyway, right? When we think about adults and adults being short or tall, if we all stood up and compared each other, it would be not in z-scores, it would be in centimeters or inches or whatever your favorite metric is in absolute terms, right? And that height for age z-score uses the standard deviation of the growth standard as the denominator, and that standard deviation represents the dispersion of values at a specific age, and it's sex-specific also. It's based on cross-sectional data. Even if the data originally were longitudinal, we're looking at a cross-section, and it goes up with age. So, for example, if you had a constant height deficit, that's going to lead to an increased height for age z-score just because of the standard deviations. And an illustration of that is here, where here we have hypothetically children who have a height for age difference that's constant at minus 10 centimeters. They're minus 10 centimeters in 2 years and all the way up at 18 years. They're 2 centimeters shorter than where they should be, but yet it looks like they're improving in height for age z-score. Why? Because the standard deviations are going up. Okay, so height for age z-scores can't be used to establish catch-up growth. Height for age difference is the correct metric. Doesn't matter. Doesn't make any difference. So, in a couple of the pieces that we published previously, data were taken from 51 countries, mostly low-income countries, low and middle-income countries. And what's plotted here is simply the average of, this is height for age z-score, a very familiar picture. And then this is height for age difference. And you can see the picture is quite different. This one seems to be telling us that after 18 or 24 months, that there's no more growth faltering going on. Whereas height for age difference is telling us, no, that's not the case. That all through this period, up to 5 years, there's continual separation from where the children should be. About 70% of it is before 24 months and 30% is afterwards. So it's not that the early period isn't important. Maybe in some sense it's the most important. That well could be. So it's not an argument against paying attention there, but it is saying that after that there's still deficits that are accruing. Right? A very different picture. Another way to see this is from the Minimat data, but and I'm showing this as a sort of hypothetical example. I didn't do this for real, but I have reviewed papers where they were doing this, where you could, I just took the data at 24 months and classified the children as whether they were stunted or not, and then asked at 54 months, 4.5 years, okay, what happened? So if you weren't stunted at 24 months, you're almost surely not stunted at 4.5 years. But if you were stunted at 24 months, only 59% were still stunted, and 41% were not stunted. All right, so that looks like improvement. That's great. So why is that? Well, so it looks like, stunting goes down from 50% to 31%. That's pretty dramatic. And height for Z-scores improve from -2, basically, up to about -1.5. So that looks like a dramatic improvement. But the height for age difference actually gets worse by about 0.5 centimeter. So again, over this period, these children were losing ground relative to the standard, but yet because of the standard deviations, at 54 months, the standard deviation is 1.4 times higher than it is 24 months. So that is what's causing the height for age Z-score to make it look like the children are gaining, when in fact they're actually still losing ground. So that then leaves us with the question, is linear growth, catch-up in linear growth even possible? So we're going to focus on groups of children less than 5 years of age because we have the availability of a counterfactual. We have the standards to tell us how children should grow. Now we can make an argument that maybe for older children we could use the reference and maybe that's good enough or not, but at least for the children under 5 we have a standard and we can use that. And we're focusing on groups because for an individual child, you never know exactly what's causing what. In fact, if you've ever spent a lot of time looking at individual growth charts of children, what stands out is how amazingly different the patterns are for young children. On average, it all looks very nice, but children, one child to another has very different patterns. So we're going to look at groups of children. Okay, so there's been some work published using Young Lives data as an example that has claimed to show catch-up growth. So let's look at those data. This is here 4 countries, Ethiopia, India, Peru, and Vietnam. So here is plotted height for HAZ and HAD. There's 2 different scales here on the left and right, and here's what the other 3 countries look like. So it's a similar pattern. There seems to be accruing between 8 months and 58 months drop in height for age Z-score, but also height for age difference. But what the authors did was they then took a subset of children who they said had evidence of catch-up growth and said, see, we selected the children who look like they're catching up in growth, and we've now declared that they're catching up in growth. So if you plot that, this is what you see. Whoops, hit the wrong button again, sorry. And so they're going up at HAZ, but if you plot their height for age difference, they're actually going down. So even the children that the authors were claiming were catching up were in fact losing ground. And the same was true across all the other 3 countries. Okay. Now, these are studies without an intervention. So by definition, the criteria weren't met anyway, and we have no reason to expect catch-up growth. There cannot be catch-up growth theoretically, conceptually, because there was no relief of the inhibiting condition. The children are in the same environment. But it also sort of reinforces that HAD is the right metric. Okay, so what studies could provide us with a way of testing whether catch-up growth is possible? Well, the strongest studies are adoption studies, where children are in a really horrible environment and then are transported sort of instantly into a much better environment, and we can compare to see what happens for children who are where that occurred. So adoption provides a dramatic improvement because of improvements in food, care, and health, and diet and care behaviors, and in terms of water, sanitation, and hygiene, and probably provides an evidence for what the upper bound could be, because it's hard without moving children to really improve their environment in such a dramatic way. So Jeff and one of his colleagues pulled together evidence from 11 adoption studies, which are all plotted here. And what you're seeing is sort of baseline at the time that the child was adopted, and then later. And you can see that not all of them, but most of them are going up, showing evidence of catch-up. And there's also this sort of sense that maybe the steepest is the ones who started the lowest. So this seems to be saying that yes, catch-up growth is possible. It might be that the worse off you were to start with, maybe the most you can catch up more. That remains to be really tested. The effects also, here you can see the ages run from about 6 months up into about 5 years, 60 months. So the effects are not limited to just children under 24 months. And the growth rates are biologically plausible, because in this particular, take one study where the adoption age was 12 months and the follow-up was 18 months, so 6 months later, that the expected velocity from the growth standards was about 6.65 centimeters. The observed mean velocity in those children was about 9. That's more than 2.5 standard deviations in the velocity standards. Okay, so this is saying that yes, if the definition was faster than normal, at the statistical limits of normality for velocity, that's what this is, right? So this is an example of that, showing that it is plausible that this can occur, but this is under, again, really substantial change in the environment. Okay, so to try to summarize and pull some of this together. So children grow through complex integrated biological mechanisms that unfold daily. We only touched on that. That length growth is a marker of nutrition that's useful for some purposes, but only some purposes and not so much others. That nutrition interventions may reach and impact children and have demonstrable and really important effects on children, but those might not be discernible when we look at impact on growth deficits, and especially in a short period. That interventions that are intended to have impact in one domain can have impact on other domains. We saw an example of nutritional inputs having impact on mortality, behavioral inputs related to infant feeding having impact on child development, and livelihood intervention trying to improve food security had effects on mothers, reduction of violence and well-being, as well as children's weight for height. And then in terms of catch-up growth, the partial restoration of lost growth is sometimes possible when the constraints are removed, but the constraints really have to be removed, and that's hard to do. But it's not even clear if this is important. That's a whole other set of issues about, is it even matter that a child has recovered some of their linear growth? What about the rest of their development? It's probably that really matters. And we pointed out that there's a lot of stuff in the literature right now talking about catch-up growth that really doesn't tell us anything about catch-up growth. And then finally, a reminder that child nutrition and growth are part of early childhood development in general. And so some implications are that when we're assessing interventions and their impact on children, we should use a broad set of measures and indicators that look at intermediate and underlying determinants like nutrition, development, and health, breastfeeding, complementary feeding and food, caregiving, hygiene, and home health. That looking at all of those, maybe one can't look at all of those in a study, but selecting the ones that we think our intervention is most likely to impact is important, and not just relying on linear growth. The second point is about the importance of developing and having a suite of measures that we can use in low and middle income countries to validate child development measures. There's a lot of work going on right now, which is helpful in that, to develop innovative markers of child development. And for us in nutrition in particular, that many of the behaviors that are important to us are self-reported, subject to social desirability bias, and we're really not working very hard as a community to deal with that, and so that's something we need to do. And then finally, the last point is to use appropriate metric and designs that are based on the 4 criteria if we're excited about trying to assess catch-up growth. Okay.
All right. Yeah, you can. While Ed pulls up my presentation, if you can, let's stand up and stretch a little bit. Come on, it's stuck in this room. Get some oxygen in your brain so you can survive the second part of this learning lab. All right. I don't want anybody not standing up to fall asleep, okay? Oh. All right, good. Part 2. Thank you. So, just an early warning that people who have seen this before, my jokes have not changed. So I can only create so many jokes per presentation. So Ed has mentioned quite a number of these things already, that in the last decade we've seen an enormous global rise in attention on nutrition. And part of that has been the attention the world is giving to stunting. This stunting focus has led to some confusion about what it means. We've talked about this a little bit already. And the third bullet says, my concern, we're 2 today, so it should be our concern, is that we might be overselling the importance of stunting. And by doing that, we may ultimately hurt the global progress, because if we under-deliver on what we call very important, then maybe funders are going to say it doesn't work, so let's put our money somewhere else. At the root of this confusion is a poor understanding of the difference between growth as an outcome, something we care about because it is important, and growth as a marker, as an indicator of something else. And we've heard some of that language already when we started the session. So I'm a strong believer in the importance of improving nutrition. Jacob, my son, told me that I had to put this up, that I haven't moved to the dark side. So I just want to point that out here. Okay, so what's the problem in a nutshell? And this is kind of the summary of the presentation. So the key premise that many of us in this community go by is that any intervention aimed at improving linear growth retardation will subsequently lead to improvements in the correlates of poor growth. And based on the literature, which I will review with you, this claim or this statement is largely not true. Okay. So because of this, stunting has become a primary development objective. And as a consequence of that, anything we do that does not improve stunting is considered a failure. Okay, this is where we are right now. Another issue is that, and Ed has talked a little bit about this already, stunting is used to count those affected and for individual rather than population level assessment. And you see statements like, does this have a pointer? Yes. That 155 million children suffer from stunting. These children begin their lives at a marked disadvantage. When you remember that distribution that Ed showed with the Chinese children, that entire distribution is shifted to the left. So for that population, you could say that all of these children start their lives with an important disadvantage, not just the ones, the 50% who fall below the cutoff. And then what we do, I've talked to Carol about this, the costing expert in the audience, but things like calculating the cost per case of stunting averted, in my opinion, makes little conceptual sense, because if we improve linear growth, we shift the distribution. So there are many children that benefit, not just the ones that happen to jump over that -2 standard deviation cutoff. Okay, so the focus of this presentation will be on the difference between outcomes and markers. And it sounds kind of easy, but my experience has been that it's a bit complex to grasp. So I'll give you 3 opportunities to understand, okay? If you don't understand it afterwards, I'm even willing to explain it again at the reception. So no stress in this room. So who has read this book, Essiotrop, by Roald Dahl? You, of course, yes. Anybody else? No? You should buy it, because now I keep giving this talk, I get a percentage at Amazon, or I have a book sold. So go online and buy it. So it's a beautiful story for children. It's about Mr. Hoppy and Miss Silver. Mr. Hoppy is a shy old man. He lives in an apartment building, and he's in love with Miss Silver. She lives 1 floor below, right? Miss Silver has a small pet tortoise called Alfie, and she has had the animal for many years, and she's a bit frustrated because he hardly grows. Okay, so growth, you see it coming, right? So he is really in love with her, and he's thinking, how can I get closer, right? So he thinks of this brilliant idea. It's like, okay, I'm going to lower this piece of paper from his balcony to hers. And he says, here on this piece of paper are some secret words that you have to whisper in Alfie's ear every day, and he will grow. Okay. What he does is he goes to all the pet stores in town and he buys every single tortoise he can find. Okay, this is his living room. And then when she's out at work, he picks up her tortoise and replaces it with one that is just a hair bigger. Okay. And after a while, she's happy because Alfie is growing. Now, enough with this already, right? We're here to work. So let's rip this story apart and think about the theory of change. So Miss Silver's theory of change is that I say essiotrop, because that's what she has to whisper in Alfie's ear. And the impact of that Alfie grows, right? For Miss Silver, the theory of change is that she says the words, I swap the tortoise. Miss Silver's trust in me grows. And Miss Silver's love for me grows too. That's what he has in mind, right? Now, for her, the growth of the animal is the outcome of interest. That's what she's interested in. For him, Alfie's growth is a marker of something else. It's a marker of her love for him. Is that clear? Okay. If you say yes, you're doing well because 2 more opportunities. If you just nod yes, please me, no stress. Okay. Now, let's move from tortoises to child stunting. This is just from the literature, the scientific literature, and it's fairly easy to find examples like this. Okay. What this is showing is that we make, as a community, claims like stunting has effects on educational attainment, stunting has numerous short and long-term consequences, stunting consequence, long-term impact. So we make causal claims about what stunting does to children. And when you I need to show this too. There's a recent review by McGovern in the International Journal of Epidemiology, and we kind of took all of the 68 papers that they include in their review and downloaded them and looked at them again. Over half of these studies make these types of direct causal claims about stunting causing or having effects or having consequences. So it's common. So if you summarize the literature or what we say, it's something like this, that linear growth causes reductions in child development, reductions in work capacity, increases in chronic disease, increases in encephalopelvic disproportion. This means the cephalo in Greek is head and the pelvis, so it's the a disconnect, or the head of the child is too big for the pelvis of the mom and you get in trouble during childbirth, okay? And then it also causes difficulty or poor birth outcomes in the next generation. So when you have a stunted mom, then the child may have poor birth outcomes. So that's what the literature says. And the world has really hurt us because this causal view is now strongly embedded among agencies and donors active in nutrition. The stunting view, the view that something leads to developmental delays, poor schooling, reduced earnings is there. As a consequence, I've said this already, it has become a very important development objective. And underlying all of this is that the belief that when we get rid of stunting, as long as we do that, everything else will magically fall in place. That's kind of the underlying premise that we're going by. And so it's not just the nutrition community, we've been loud enough and clear enough on this that other communities have kind of taken this from us and run with it. And just 2 examples, one is the aflatoxin literature. When you talk to toxicologists working on aflatoxin, they have some studies showing that there is an association between aflatoxin and linear growth of children. So we, or part of our community and the toxicologists, have jumped on this, hoping that if only aflatoxin is removed, then stunting will disappear and everything else, the sun will start shining and, the lions and the sheep will be together in the meadow and stuff like that. Anyway, they don't say that, but it's again that belief. And then catch-up growth, Ed talked about that. The rationale there too is if children catch up, the other things will be taken care of as well. Now, if this thinking, causal thinking, is correct, what it implies, and now pay attention to the screen, the magic is coming. So hold on. All right. So it implies that if linear growth disappears, that rather than red arrows going the wrong way, we'll have green arrows going the right way. So we'll see improvements in child development, work capacity, reductions in chronic disease, in difficulty during childbirth, and improvements in birth outcomes. But what does the evidence say when you look at the literature? Okay, and here I need to take a little pause because there's a kind of a challenge that I'll try to make clear. You can first read this and see if you think it's funny. I'll look at your faces while you read it. It's not that funny, it looks like. All right, so I'll try to make a point. That can happen. You never know how funny jokes are when you do a presentation. All right, so I'll do this another way. So this is my phone, right? And I put it on this chair. Okay. Now, if I make the claim that my cell phone is in this room, who agrees with that statement? Right? Okay, good. Now I'm going to ask you to just put my cell phone away, like hide it. Okay, put it away. I can't see it. Is it gone? Yes? Okay. Now I come in and it's like, oh, my cell phone is here. Where is my cell phone? I'm looking everywhere, like here in my pockets, in my backpack. Okay. My conclusion is my cell phone is not in this room. Who agrees with that claim? Nobody. Okay. The point I'm trying to make is that I did a bit of research here to look for my phone, like in my backpack, my pockets here. But I've clearly not exhausted all possibilities of where it might be, right? The point I'm trying to make is that showing that something does not exist is a lot harder than proving that something does exist, right? I really want my phone back now. Okay. That's the point I'm trying to make. So I'm going through the literature and I'm trying to make a point that a lot of the causal claims are not true. That is almost impossible, right? So the best we can do is read the literature carefully and see if there's any kind of strong evidence for the causal claims. And in the absence of those, the best we can do is like, nobody has really shown that there is a causal effect from stunting on these outcomes. Are you with me? Okay, good. So next time we won't use this thing anymore. Ed thought it was funny, and I thought it was funny too. Okay, so stunting on child development. There is no doubt there's a very strong association between both, right? There's tons of papers on that. But when you talk to and read papers by people, experts in cognitive development, they say that linear growth is not part of the mechanistic path to delayed development. Two possibilities have been raised as potentially causal. One is that smaller body size reduces your motor activity, it reduces how you explore the world, and that would have negative consequences on your development. But that turns out not to be true because your exploration, your ability to explore has nothing to do with your size. It's other processes in your body that are responsible for that. And the second one is the Rosenthal effect. If you're short and you're in the classroom or your parents identify you as short and potentially having little capacity to do well, maybe that will cause your teachers, your parents not to pay a lot of attention to you, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, that has been shown in the education literature. If a child doesn't look like worth the investment, then very often they just ignore it because little Johnny, he doesn't have it anyway, so why spend my time on him, right? Now, it's unlikely that that is a mechanism because, again, I'm going back to the Chinese distribution. In the places we work, the entire distribution is shifted to the left. So it's not like some children stand out as particularly short. Everybody is short, right? So that cannot be the driving force here. So our conclusion here is that there's no evidence in the literature that linear growth causes delays in child development. And looking at the mechanisms, the current understanding of mechanisms, there's also no indication that it could be part of the biological pathway to child development. So that's our conclusion here. The first pathway, there is simply no evidence. The second one is work capacity. Again, there's a lot of literature, mostly in the economics literature, that there's an association between how tall you are and your earnings. Now the question is, again, is it causal? the reasons to question the causality of the association is that it's hard to think of a biological kind of mechanism, and one that people, well, I'll get to that in a second. Interestingly, when you look at this association, it's found in developed countries too, where supposedly nobody has suffered from growth retardation. So if it's present in developed countries, then thinking back about the China example, if you could shift that entire distribution to the right, there would still be people shorter than others, and they would still potentially be discriminated against in the labor market and have lower earnings than the taller ones. So by solving the problem of linear growth retardation, we wouldn't take this problem away. So that really undermines like the causality of that relationship. And then there's one very interesting paper. It's really unfortunate there's only one, using the Guatemala supplementation study from the 60s, where Behrman, who is an economist, and colleagues tried to statistically separate the effects that intervention had on physical attributes and cognitive attributes. And what they conclude, and this is in Guatemala, in a population that is active in agricultural jobs, so physical strength is important because that's the argument that is often made. What they find is that only intellectual and not physical improvements were part of that link between the intervention and earnings. Okay, so that's the strongest kind of statistical evidence or epidemiological evidence we have. So again, we conclude here that there's no evidence that linear growth retardation causes lower earnings. And based on our current understanding, it's not likely that they're causally related. Okay. The third one we're looking at is chronic disease. This is often reported in the literature that stunted children are more prone to non-communicable diseases later in life. When you look at the literature on the developmental origins of chronic disease, it's very clear that the mechanisms are the changes in the structure and the function of organs, like the brain and the liver. And then another pathway is changes in gene expression and changes in senescence, so how fast cells get old in your body, right? There is no evidence when you look at this literature that this has anything to do with how tall you are. Now, where does the confusion come from? Oh, that's not here, that should be here. Okay, so I'll tell you where the confusion comes from. You can look at me and not at the slide. It comes from the early papers on the early origins of chronic disease. The only metric they had of what went wrong in utero was birth weight, the size of the child when it was born. So the early studies used that as a marker and found important effects. Now, the literature has advanced and people have gone down levels and started looking at mechanisms, but somehow in many people's heads, and mine too, we were stuck with this image that birth weight or birth size is part of the mechanisms explaining why you are more prone to diabetes and overweight and so on. But there's no evidence for that. It's a marker that was used in the literature 20 years ago or so. So when you look at the epidemiological evidence, the cohort studies, they find that lower birth weight, they did not look at birth length, and lower linear growth rates were not associated with increases in cardiovascular risk or plasma glucose concentration. There's a study in South Africa, cohort 2. The children who were not stunted at 24 months actually had higher BMI for age Z-scores, not lower. And then in Peru, similarly, stunting at 12 months was associated with a decreased risk of having a high BMI Z-score. So there is quite a bit of evidence out there. I mean, this is all observational, obviously, but interesting evidence that kind of tells us that there is no evidence that linear growth causes chronic diseases. Okay, now we have 4 and 5. 4 was related to encephalopelvic disproportion. And here we kind of have to construct the story, and I can tell you already, we believe this is causal. And why do we believe it's causal? Because when you don't grow well as a child, you will be a shorter adult, we know that. You'll have a smaller pelvic inlet, and then there will be a mismatch between the size of the fetal head, or there might be, and the dimensions of the birth canal. So stature and pelvic size are linked to the size of your skeleton. Okay, so we believe that if you're short, that your pelvis is smaller, and you are more. The risk of this problem happening is higher. So we believe this is causal. Now, thinking about the burden, or going into that a little bit more, the burden of obstructed labor is 3% of all maternal mortality is related to obstructed labor. And that's about 10,000 maternal deaths per year, which is a lot, but in the total, it's a relatively small proportion of the total mortality in women or in mothers. And when it comes to disability, this number is high. 40% of the total number of years lost due to disability among all of the maternal disorders. But when you look at this literature, this has dropped tremendously over the last year. So there's quite a bit of improvement in the quality of obstetric care women receive. So that is probably helping with the reduction in disability. What we don't know from the literature, nobody has calculated this, what fraction of this burden of mortality and morbidity is actually attributable to linear growth retardation. We don't know that. So that would be a percentage of this 3% and this 40%. We don't know how much that is. Okay. Okay, and then the last one is birth outcomes. When you are short as a girl, then you will be short as an adult. And we know that that will lead to smaller children. Okay. This seems to be due to physical constraints in utero. So that seems to be driving why these children are small. So here we again conclude that the association between linear growth retardation at childhood and birth outcomes in the next generation is a causal one. Let's look at the burden again. 3.6% of neonatal deaths, or around 100,000 deaths globally, are due to maternal short stature. And morbidity, we don't know how much that is. Okay. So eliminating maternal short stature would have a modest effect on total neonatal mortality. I mean, I'm not saying that 100,000 children dying is not a large number, but it's a relatively small number of the total amount of child mortality that we're looking at globally every year. Okay, so we looked at I think I have this on a slide. Okay, so we looked at 5 consequences, quote unquote. Based on the literature, we've established that 3 of these are not causal and 2 are causal. But for these 2, the burden in terms of mortality and morbidity is somewhat limited. Okay, that's the bottom line of what the exercise we've just done. Okay, so we started with this framework. What we're proposing is a different framework. So we've established that linear growth causes these 2 outcomes. Okay. We know from the literature that a deficient environment causes linear growth retardation. And when I say a deficient environment, I mean everything related to not having adequate diets, being sick all the time, not being cared for properly, all of those things we know. So that's what we summarize as the deficient environment. And the deficient environment causes problems with child development, work capacity, and physiological functioning, which, I mean, this is the non-communicable diseases. Okay, so this is the framework we propose. So stunting or linear growth retardation is not part of the causal pathway to these 3 outcomes. That's basically the bottom line of what we're trying to convey here. Now, we're adding more complexity to this framework. This is where the markers come in again. So what we're writing here is that linear growth retardation is a marker of the past. What does this mean? When you go into a community and you see that children are not growing well, you know that reflects deficient environments. These children up to today have not received what they should have received to grow well. That's a valid statement, okay? The other thing we know is that when you go into a community and you see that children are not growing well, we can say with certainty that in the future, these children will not develop properly, that work capacity will be limited in this community or for once they're adults, and that there will be issues with their physiological functioning. Okay, so it's a marker of what has happened, and it tells us something about what is going to happen in the future. Is that clear? Yeah. So I think this was the second attempt at explaining the difference between an outcome and a marker. Okay, I saw, I think, 5 additional heads nodding, so we still have a bit of work to do. All right, this is the third opportunity for you to understand. Okay, so I'm in my house and I have a fire, right? So the smoke. I live in the U.S., so we're obsessed with safety in the U.S. Okay, so we have smoke alarms. The smoke alarm goes off. I call the firefighters. I think the firefighters. Yeah, they're here. Okay, so the firefighters come to my house. What will they do when they arrive? Do they turn off the smoke alarm? What do they do? Extinguish the fire, right? So they don't come for the marker, they come for the problem, right? So what we need to do, I'm not sure, no. What we need to do with stunting is we need to look at it as the smoke alarm. It's a marker of a problem. And in a sense, it's like what I said before. It reflects something that has gone wrong in the past. I mean, a fire was started and smoke has come from that fire, right? And it also tells us a lot about the future of my house, because if you don't take care of it, it's not going to look very good, right? So it's a marker. But when the action comes, that's not what we focus on. We focus on the fire. And that's really how stunting needs to be viewed, in our opinion. Okay? Okay. So if you don't get it now, then you need to talk to me during the reception. Okay, so is this new? It's not, and that's actually quite surprising. In this paper from '94 by Ray Martorell, whom some of you may know, he actually writes that some of these functional correlates, such as poor school performance, yada, 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 are not the direct outcomes of growth failure, but instead reflect shared causes. That's, in different words, exactly what we're saying here, okay? 94 is, how long ago? 25 years ago? Yeah, it's remarkable how we have collectively forgotten what was written, okay? Now, in a paper by Kate Dewey not so long ago, she also says this: there's direct cause, a key marker, and then Bill and Melinda, who you've heard of, I assume, actually in a letter also said something similar. It's actually a child's height. It's not a child's height we're concerned about, rather stunting is a proxy. Okay, so this has been out there, just so you don't accuse me of stealing other people's idea. So when I presented this, no, I didn't present this. I was in a meeting 2.5 years ago, and I thought the meeting was kind of going too much into stunting and linear growth, and I wanted to say something, but I had not written a paper. So I get the mic and I say, well, I think we shouldn't focus so much on stunting because it's the other things that are important. And there's a British person whose name shall remain unknown to you across the table, and he's very kind of well-spoken. And he tells me, oh, it doesn't matter, whatever is good to fight stunting is good for other outcomes. So what you're saying is just semantics. And I was like, I'm sitting there and I don't know what to say. So I go back to my hotel room and I felt really bad that I didn't have a good kind of comeback for him. So, but it triggered me to think harder about this. And now there's a section in the paper, just semantics, question mark. And, you know, it's his contribution. He doesn't even know. So what he said, it doesn't matter, whatever is good to reduce stunting is also good for the other outcomes. I have 3 reasons, not just one, I have 3 reasons to disagree with this. The first one is that improving linear growth is often not necessary, and Ed has given you examples of this already. We do not have to fix growth completely to have significant and, most importantly, meaningful impacts on important outcomes. And let me show this to you using this kind of theoretical graph. So what we have here is the dose of an intervention. And the dose could be anything we do to improve the lives of children. So you can think of food supplements, cash transfers, BCC, improving the health conditions, all of that stuff. You know, so you can provide less or more of that, right? And then here we have outcomes. And let's assume that this dotted line here, or dashed line here, is like the cutoff for a meaningful effect, something that, you know, makes a difference in the life of these children. So let's take an example from Alive and Thrive. Improvements in breastfeeding and complementary feeding, right? We all agree that that is a relevant outcome. Who cares about breastfeeding in this room? I do. We all do care about breastfeeding. And complementary feeding, we all care that that is important, right? So impacts in these things will probably happen at a dose below the dose that we need to see impacts on linear growth, right? Because to improve linear growth, we need to do these drastic things like adoption. Ed showed that graph. Okay, so it's not the kind of the correlate of that is that if you don't improve linear growth, you may have done things that are still good and useful and relevant. That's the point we're trying to make. Okay. The second one is that improving linear growth is often not sufficient. Take a well-growing child with anemia, right, that grows up in a village with poor schooling, or schools with teachers that don't show up and are poorly paid and not motivated. Are we excited about the future of this child? No. So even though that child is growing really well, I'm not too excited about his or her future, right? So it's not a sufficient condition. Growing well it doesn't take care of all of your problems. And the third reason I disagree is that linear growth, improving that, is not cost efficient. Addressing outcomes directly is more efficient than trying to address them indirectly through linear growth. If we care about cognitive development, we should have interventions that directly focus on cognitive development and not try to improve linear growth and then hope for the best in the cognitive development department. That does not make sense. Another example I'm giving here is obstructed labor. If we want to reduce obstructed labor through improvements in linear growth, we're basically saying that we're starting the investment now, and in 20 to 25 years, we'll start to reap the benefits of that investment. That's a long time frame, right? And we've seen that the percentages, I mean, we don't even know what the return is going to be because we don't know what percentage of that obstructed labor we could actually fix with having taller mothers, okay? I talked to a friend who is a professor at UCSF. She's an obstetrician. And she told me if you have adequate obstetric care, you can detect obstructed labor before it starts, and you do a C-section or you do whatever else is necessary. So it doesn't require highly skilled staff or complex machines or whatnot. It just requires women to have access to adequate obstetric care, which is something we should strive for anyway. I mean, having that in place obviously provides a lot of other benefits that go beyond just preventing the mother and or the child dying. You see my point, okay? Okay. A couple of other concerns is that a single focus on stunting unnecessarily downplays the importance of interventions that only improve infant and young child feeding practices, dietary adequacy, water hygiene, and sanitation practices. It came as a bit of a surprise to me when the SHINE and the WASH benefits results came out that there was massive disappointment that it didn't improve stunting, as if providing people with clean water and toilets is not a very commendable thing to do. I mean, we should be excited about that, right? It's like, oh, it didn't improve stunting. Massive failure, okay? Single focus on stunting may undermine efforts to engage with other sectors. It's hard to have the ag sector, the agriculture sector, be excited about linear growth. They don't care. They don't want to sign up for this. We should engage them when it comes to things that they care about. I mean, they produce food. Let's get them enthusiastic about producing diets that are affordable, that provide all the nutrients we need. You know, that's something they know how to do. The same with social protection. Social protection, they know how to give out cash or food baskets. They know how to improve household expenditure, but we shouldn't hold them accountable for improvements in linear growth. That probably scares them away rather than getting them involved and excited about nutrition. And finally, there's this sense of fatalism. Little or nothing can be done after 2 years of age. You know, that's also a consequence of the focus on stunting. Ed has shown this graph that stunting continues, or linear growth retardation continues at least up to 5 years. We haven't looked beyond 5 years. And interventions in other domains like ECD can still make a difference. Like my children are 9 and 12 and they both go to school. I mean, that is really the underlying premise there, is that I believe that there is a lot of margin for growth in their development. I would guess that everybody here who has children sends them to school, right? And they're all older than 2 years old, right? So that too is like that. At 2, it's like, well, sorry, Johnny, your window has closed. We'll try with your sibling. I mean, your mom is pregnant again. I mean, it does not make sense. Before kind of pushing this too far, things move. I mean, you saw the growth velocity curve, right? So the biology shows us that when things are growing fast, I mean, the plasticity is higher at younger ages. So it does make sense to do whatever we want to do at the earliest possible age. But we should definitely not give up on those who have grown out of that window and still need our attention. I mean, that's what we do in the Western world anyway. Okay, so the proposed way forward is we need to be specific, and we need to stop saying that undernutrition equals stunting. And stunting is also not the same as linear growth retardation. Stunting is those children who fall below -2. Linear growth retardation is everybody who doesn't grow the way they should grow. And going back to the China example, that distribution, 50% of the kids are stunted, 100% of these children are not growing well. There's a big difference between the two. We need to be explicit about why we focus on stunting. Is it for population assessment to count children that are affected, program design and evaluation? And in programs, is it used as a marker of another outcome? And if that is the case, we should really ask ourselves, why don't we measure that outcome directly? That makes a lot more sense, right? Or is it an outcome of immediate interest? And then you really have to build a strong case as to why you still think, after listening to this, that it is an outcome of interest. For population assessment, it's definitely okay. It's a good marker. And it's definitely useful to compare regions, to compare countries over time, to see the south of Ghana is doing better than the north of Ghana, or Ghana has improved from 94 to 98 to 2002. You know, it does the job. There's no problem with that. For counting cases, there's limitations. I've said this already. I don't need to repeat all of this. And then for programs and impact evaluation, I strongly believe that growth is not a good primary outcome. We should stop using it as a primary outcome. Stunting is linked causally to two outcomes, which can be more effectively addressed through direct interventions. Okay. And secondly, we should focus on what matters and can respond to the interventions we implement. And there is no shortage of things we care about and we can measure. Morbidity, dietary intake, food security, child development, you see them there. What I often get as like an argument against this is like, yeah, but these are so much harder to measure. Yes, that's true. But we can invest in better measurements and move the field forward in that sense too. But just measuring stunting because it's easy and relatively cheap, I mean, that doesn't fly, I think. Okay, in case you cannot get enough of this, there is a paper in Advances of Nutrition, which is free. I mean, how do you say it? Open access, that's the term I was looking for. You can download it for free. And then there is a 3.5-minute kind of video you can watch also for free on YouTube. And, you know, again, I need more views, so. All right, thank you very much for your attention. So this is a bit small, but the story ends, they get married. Which is interesting because it's a children's book, and this is actually a marriage based on a lie. So if you think about it a bit more. How much time do we have left? 20 minutes, that's not bad. All right, questions? Or do you want to say something? Okay. So, yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for interesting to turn it around. I thought about the impact we see of dairy products, that we see like a specific, it's a more physiological stimulation of length growth. Mm-hmm. So with this framework, we should actually more, I mean, milk or dairy product is a good food, mm-hmm. But the specific stimulation, when we do interventions and see impact on stunting, we should actually take it out of the equation because it's not really, it's not really an indicator for anything else that one physiological impact.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to respond or? So I think that's a very good question, and you gave the answer already. Milk or dairy products are a very high quality product. I mean, there's animal protein, provide a lot of advantages. So to me, whether it improves linear growth or not, in a sense, is a bit irrelevant. I would like to see studies that show that, you know, does it improve children's development? or does it reduce morbidity? Things that, functional outcomes that we care about. And I'm saying it so strongly because I was at a session a couple of weeks ago at the ASN meeting, the American Society for Nutrition in Baltimore, on chicken eggs, where the one study that showed a massive impact on linear growth retardation, they've looked now at the longer term impacts and there's nothing there, and they've repeated the study in another country and there doesn't seem to be anything there. So that really begs the question. So let's say we repeat this 5 more times and we don't find an impact on an association between feeding an egg every day and linear growth. Does that change how we look at eggs, chicken eggs? No. I mean, it's a high quality source of protein. And you can, I mean, I had young children, you can boil it and mash it and feed it to a very young child. I mean, it has desirable properties. You don't need to refrigerate it. You can kind of keep it in decent conditions, even at room temperature. So there's a lot of good things about eggs. So why do we need to keep pushing that button? Does it improve linear growth? I don't think
it's
that's
just
useful.
the dairy is off, but that's the difference you see for other protein sources is the impact on
Yeah.
linear growth.
Well, what's interesting is that the impact is mostly in older children. It's in children like 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 years of age. It's never in the children 0 to 5. At least I have not seen evidence of that. Okay. Other questions?
In fact, meta-analysis on the iron supplementation and fortification also
Hold it a bit closer.
don't show any change on the growth parameters. Though it is said that iron is important for growth, but meta-analysis on the RCTs do not show the positive effect or the concluding effect of supplementation and fortification and growth.
Mm-hmm.
So individually, the association correlation studies are there cross-sectional,
Yeah.
but the meta-analysis on RCT couldn't
Okay.
record that.
So you agree with
Yeah.
Okay, we've convinced one person. Any other questions or Richmond?
In the context of this, what is the relevance for programs like growth monitoring, growth promotion? What are your thoughts on that?
I didn't see this one coming. That's a very good question. And we've started to do some thinking around this topic. I think it would be a bit early for us to kind of make grand statements, but it clearly has impacts. What the story we've just told has clearly, but I mean, I'm happy for Ed to say more of that, but I want to kind of clarify my thinking a bit more before I kind of answer your question. So maybe in a year we'll have another learning lab somewhere else and I'll respond to your question.
But GMP is actually weight, then? People don't usually measure length.
No. That's true.
In those programs. I mean, there are people who say we should, but that's interesting.
Before I go to you, I want to give Ed an opportunity to say something. Okay. What do you think is this one?
Yeah, that's true. It's about weight, but there's also an interest in discourse about, well, why are we interested in weight? Because weight will tell us something about linear growth, so it's still there. And in some places, there's been a real push to have linear growth be assessed. Have in community programs an attempt to do that, which is obviously has many challenges. I'm not looking at what Jeff's doing. I guess the other thing I would say about growth monitoring programs is and one of the things that makes it complicated is that those programs are embedded in communities, in doing things in communities that are not necessarily really about the growth itself. One of my doctoral students was working in rural areas of Mexico, and her study is about how mothers make and caregivers make choices about food. So, but so she wasn't looking for this in particular, but it was very clear for these moms that when their child size is assessed periodically, that's important for them. They pay attention to that, and they are thinking about they want their children to be well nourished, and the way
see that the vision they have for that is about their size, and so somehow it's still important to them. So to just say, well, there's a lot of negative things one could say about the way most growth monitoring and promotion programs are run, but we have to, I think, be really thoughtful about and careful about understanding what it would mean to, in some sense, challenge that. There was a meeting, I guess it was last fall, that the World Bank convened. There's a report out about that. So there's lots of discussion that's in there, no real conclusion. They didn't really answer the question either. But it's an important question. And I think one of the reasons why it's an important question is that that there's only so much in the way of resources that we have. And one of the biggest challenges in any field, even in businesses, is investing in legacy things that actually don't bring the benefits we need when there's other things we could invest in. So it's an important question to pursue, but we're going to have to be thoughtful about it. And any thoughts any of you have, would be, we'd love to hear about it, because we're sort of gingerly, with Rosmi here, and some others thinking about, is there a way we can comment about it that's actually going to be helpful?
Can it is like giving a positive stimulation in the community to be mindful about the nutrition care of the child through this activity?
We can't hear the question.
What she's saying is that that it gives a positive stimulation in the community for community members to be thinking about these issues. So that's a potential benefit, and we don't want to just throw that away because the growth measures themselves aren't. So those are exactly the kinds of things we have to think about.
Okay, I'll get to you, but Kenda was really first, so.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for really unbelievably clear presentations on an important topic that I think we need to reflect more on. I was just thinking about the context in which donors are increasing, thinking about impact evaluations, and the general agreement with you that we should look at outcomes and not just stunting. But how that would play out in the world of larger and larger multi-sectoral programs. And so one of the challenges that we struggle with is at the outcome level, we have so many that we're tasked with improving ANC, GMP, PNC, complementary feeding, and IOCF, there's already 9 indicators. Do you create a scale of all these indicators that's not validated? And so thinking about what you said about stunting being a marker of the underlying environment, if a multi-sectoral program is supposed to be tackling all those different factors of the underlying environment, is it then a good impact outcome for those programs, or how do you balance this? Because otherwise you would have so many primary outcomes, and I'm a bit struggling with that.
Okay. I think I hear 2 questions there. The first one is related to when we do randomized trials or impact evaluations, the rules of the game have become stricter in the sense that when you plan this, you write your protocol, you register your protocol online, you say, this is what we're doing, this is the intervention, and this is what we will be looking at. And the idea is that you do that so you can't be, it doesn't allow people to then go on a massive fishing expedition afterwards to just say, it's like, of these 500 things we measured, we were successful in improving 3, and that's what we will write a paper about and call it a success, right? When you look at recommendations to do this well, you're absolutely right that they say you should have 1, 2, 3, a very small number of primary outcomes that you declare, and then that's what you can make causal inferences about. This is a huge issue for the types of programs we look at. And on Friday there's a panel discussion. We will not be providing answers to these questions, but the objective of the panel discussion is to kind of identify where the questions are, like where do we collectively struggle as a community to do these types of studies, and where do we need better guidance. And I've been discussing with a couple of people that better guidance is urgently needed. So with bringing it back to stunting, you're absolutely right, and that's why in a couple of the impact evaluations that I've been involved in, when you look at the theory of change, you work on improved health and improved dietary intake, and you do BCC to improve caregiving practices. So if all went perfectly well, you should see an improvement in that kind of global indicator or comprehensive indicator of linear growth retardation. Very often the impact is not there, or it's very small. And if we declare that the primary outcome, then we kind of put all of the others kind of in the shadow. I mean, they don't get enough attention, and that's my personal concern.